My name is Khalil Perry, and I'm doing my PowerPoint presentation on the African American enlistment in the Civil War.
Freemen during the Civil War. At the beginning of the Civil War, both the white generals and soldiers were assuming that African Americans would not make good soldiers and they were cowards. Basically, African Americans needed to prove that they were capable enough to fight. They did that by showing their abilities to the generals in more than enough battles. After they showed their abilities, General Blunt added that he had never saw anyone fight as good and as hard as the African Americans, and the question that African Americans fighting in the Civil War was settled. There were many causes of the Civil War both in the North and South. The first cause of the Civil War were state rights. The North believed that the federal government and Constitution are supreme throughout the nation, while the South believed in state rights and believed that the federal government did not have the right to tell them what to do. The second cause of the Civil War was slavery. In 1860, only about 25% of Southerners owned slaves, but most Southerners felt that slave labor was essential for their economy. Northerners, on the other hand, opposed slavery mainly because of job competition between free and slave laborers. The third cause of the Civil War was tariff disputes. The South wanted low tariffs while the North wanted high tariffs to protect its manufactured goods against the competition of foreign goods. The fourth cause of the Civil War were different economies. The South wanted agriculture while the North wanted dominance in industry. Another cause of the Civil War were cultural differences. Southern were planters while the northern states were industrialists. Treatment of African Americans. Discrimination still occurred in many areas even though African Americans proved their loyalty and abilities to the Union Army. Soldiers of African descent were to receive $10 a month plus a clothing deduction of $3.50 according to the Militia Act of 1862. White soldiers received $13 a month with no deduction at all. African Americans struggled with these problems until June 15, 1864, when equal pay for all black soldiers were granted by the Congress. And these photos are basically some examples of how African Americans were treated. As you can see the African Americans, they're picking cotton, and they're looks like they're in the bottom left. Looks like she did something wrong, so she's getting punished for it, or in other words, she's probably just getting punished for no reason at all by just doing her job. So I mean, they were treated very badly, you know. So African Americans in the Union. 200,000 African Americans served in the Union Army and the Navy. The Union was segregated into all-black units such as the Massachusetts 54th Regiment. They were also treated unfairly by the white generals and soldiers. Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation allowed African Americans to be enlisted into the Union Army. African Americans wanted to participate in wars in earlier dates. They were prohibited by a federal law that dated back to 1792. President Lincoln feared that the border states would secede from the Union if African American recruitment was authorized. The Union Army consisted of about 10% of African Americans, and one-third of all blacks that were enrolled in the militia lost their lives during the Civil War. One division of the African American Army was known as the Army of Freemen, in which 37,000 African Americans passed away. This picture is basically an illustration of the Civil War, and it shows you how deadly the Civil War was. As you can see someone on the ground. Looks like his head is chopped off. You can see people getting stabbed, people getting shot. Yeah, it was just deadly overall. African Americans in the Confederacy. Over 65,000 blacks, both slaves and freemen, were enlisted in the Confederate Army. This picture is describing is basically a picture of multiple African Americans that were enlisted in the Confederate Army, and it was a picture taken in Louisiana in 1861. Confederate use of African Americans. General Patrick Claiborne used slaves as soldiers since their services were being used in the Union Army. He suggested freedom among the African Americans if they survived the war. Jefferson Davis, on the other hand, didn't allow it and said that no one should discuss the conversation ever again. The South started to lose more ground in 1864, and many believed that slaves would be a big help by joining the Confederate Army. The Confederate Congress passed the General Order 14 on March 13, and President Davis signed it. The order was issued on March 23, 1865, but the war ended before the slaves could be used. Confederacy treatment of the African Americans. African Americans of the Confederate Army treatment was way better than their northern counterparts. Free blacks earned the same pay as the white Confederate privates. In Rockbridge County, Virginia, skilled black workers got paid 3 times more than the white Confederate soldiers in the amount of $350 to $600 a year. Slavery during the war. Since slavery was on the edge during the Civil War, many slaves escaped to the North to fight alongside the Union forces. This was known as contraband camps. Many slaves remained on the plantation for reasons that were unknown and helped their masters on the plantations and behind the Confederate forces. African Americans also served as nurses, cooks, and blacksmiths. The South refused to arm blacks, so instead they used them to build forts and perform camp duties. Blacks also served as spies and scouts in the Union Army to provide valuable information about the Confederates' plans and forces. Escaped slaves were referred to as contrabands, while spies were also known as black dispatches. Harriet Tubman is a prime example of spies, scouts, and agents because she led a raid outside Beaufort, South Carolina in 1863. The end of slavery. The first Confiscation Act took place in 1861, which made it legal to claim enemy property at times of war and many contraband. The second act took place July of 1862, which freed slaves, allowing the Union to use the former slaves in any way that they desired. In 1865, the 13th Amendment freed 4 million people from slavery and 500,000 from the border states. They received full protection of the Constitution and were now known as full citizens. Lincoln said if states were still rebelling by January 1st, 1863, he would free all slaves from the southern states. U.S. government recognizes the slaves in the South as free, but there were still slaves in the border states outside of Lincoln's control. The Emancipation Proclamation commits the U.S. to a policy of abolition in the South. As the Union Army started to progress, more slaves were freed.